Hello, and welcome to the Magic of Calvin and Hobbes, a fan celebration. My name is Ryan, and I am a self-proclaimed Calvin and Hobbes superfan and expert.
And my name is also Ryan, although most people call me Indy.
Merry Christmas, everybody! On November 18th, 1985, Calvin and Hobbes first graced the world with their presence, and now, over 40 years later, we are celebrating the anniversary of this greatest comic of all time by releasing 40 episodes during the next year. We'll discuss the characters, the history, the art, and everything else related to Calvin and Hobbes. And we're releasing this episode on Christmas Eve. So, fittingly, the topic is Christmas and Santa. Kind of a follow up to our last episode on winter in Calvin and Hobbes. Now, note there's a lot of interconnection between those topics here, so we'll probably be jumping around within different Christmas strips to illustrate different points. But before we jump into that, as always, just a little housekeeping. We're not affiliated with Bill Watterson. We're not affiliated with his syndicate, so we can't display any of the comics that we're referencing. But we will tell you where you can find them on either Go Comics or in the books, because for every comic that we reference, we'll give you the date that it was originally published and the books and page numbers that they can be found in. And we'll include all of that and a link in the show notes for each episode. So with that in mind, let's jump in. Christmas. Calvin loves Christmas. So, Indy, to you, what would you say is Calvin's idea of the meaning of Christmas?
It seems to mainly be about getting lots of presents or loot, as he often refers to it, under the Christmas tree.
Yeah, I would say so. It's not so much a religious holiday for Calvin. Well, in some ways it maybe kind of is. We'll talk about that in a second. But, there's strips where he talks about how he's willing to believe in Santa, even though he has some skepticism about it, because ultimately he decides he's not willing to risk his presence over whether or not he believes in Santa. And to him, that he says it's the spirit of Christmas.
Yes, a very practical attitude there. Now, we can say secondarily, we do get a little bit about the value of friendship there, specifically the love between him and Hobbes. But yes, primarily he's focused on how many presents he will or may not get depending on his behavior.
Yeah, and I will say, just coming back to the idea of religion, Calvin at one point does say, what better way to celebrate a religious holiday than with a month of frenzied consumerism? And Hobbes expresses some surprise that other religions haven't picked up on that, and Calvin says, getting tons of loot is a very spiritual experience for me. So, it's religious for him in his own way, I guess.
Not a classically religious sense.
Yeah, but Calvin does occasionally invoke kind of religious symbols in his celebration of Christmas, again, for, his own practical reasons. For example, there's the strip where he takes a halo on a stick and puts it over his head and says, "'Tis the season to advertise," because he wants to get presents by at least making people think that he's been good so that Santa will bring him lots of stuff. So he's doing everything he can to give the appearance of being a good kid. And we'll talk about that some more in this episode as well.
And there actually is a psychological effect called the halo effect, where if we see someone as good or having positive attributes in one way, there's a tendency to want to describe other sorts of positive attributes or goodness to them too, which may or may not be deserved. So this is a pretty literal example of that, but that's what Calvin's going for. And there is psychological reasons to think this kind of thing can work.
Yeah, I had thought I knew about, if you're doing a political campaign, you want the photo ops of you kissing babies and petting puppies and whatever. I didn't know that it had a name, and I didn't know that it was the halo effect specifically. So that's very fitting.
Oh, yes. I guess Calvin actually makes use of this in other contexts too. This is getting a little bit away from our Christmas topic, but there's a strip where he wants to create a fictitious childhood for himself. So he clears off half of his bed in the messy room and then has Hobbes take a picture of him and says, "Oh, look, this looks like I'm great at keeping my room clean, and I had this positive childhood in these ways." I think Hobbes eventually says, "Is this legal?" So yeah, Calvin's no stranger to this kind of thing.
Yeah, he likes to manipulate people's perceptions, I guess. Now, I want to take a minute and step away from Calvin for a second and talk about Calvin's dad, who kind of takes the opposite tack from Calvin, at least in some ways, where he criticizes the commercialism of Christmas.
That's right. So there's one in particular where Calvin's watching a Christmas special on TV, and his father is kind of looking over the chair there, and he says, "Oh, look, yet another Christmas TV special. How touching to have the meaning of Christmas brought to us by cola, fast food, and beer conglomerates. Who'd have ever guessed product consumption, popular entertainment, and spirituality would mix so harmoniously? It's a beautiful world, all right." To which Calvin remarks, "Dad doesn't handle the season's stress very gracefully."
Yeah, so Calvin's dad doesn't like the commercialism associated with Christmas for various reasons, but it kind of makes me wonder where Calvin's family overall falls on the why we celebrate Christmas spectrum. Because, it is originally obviously a religious holiday, but there are plenty of people who celebrate it more in just a secular sort of way. And so I wonder, Calvin's dad doesn't like the consumerism. Does Calvin's family celebrate at all for religious reasons? It's a little unclear to me how religious they are. I don't think Bill Watterson's family was particularly religious. I'm not sure about this, but I kind of imagine he didn't view Calvin's family that way either. But I'm not sure. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I know what you're saying because other than Calvin himself, there's not a whole lot of explicit references to God. Now, Calvin does seem to believe in God in at least a general sense. So, for instance, there's a strip where he's upset that even though it's winter, there's no snow and he wants to go sledding. So he keeps begging and pleading and yelling for there to be snow. And in the last strip, his prayer is not answered. And he says, "Do you want me to become an atheist?" So
Yeah.
there's that, and then kind of a similar scenario. There's a strip where he rips his pants at recess, and then he realizes he can't really walk around without accidentally flashing his underwear at everybody. So he's in class praying that he will not be called to go demonstrate a problem at the chalkboard. And it's like, oh, well, I'll always be good. I'll never ask for anything again. This, and then he does, in fact, as you could imagine, get called up. And so you hear him thinking, well, so much for my ever joining the clergy. So then there's also, again, tying it back more into questions about Santa, there's a strip where he and Hobbes are specifically talking about the meaning of the holiday and how Calvin has certain questions about Santa, right? So it's like, well, if Santa really does exist, why all the mystery? Why all the secrecy? And Hobbes says, well, I don't know, isn't this a religious holiday? To which Calvin responds, yeah, but actually, I have the same questions about God. So it seems like Calvin has a sort of general belief in God, at least to some degree. And I would say, to me, that suggests that probably his parents also believe in God in some sense. It would be kind of weird if Calvin did, but they didn't.
Right.
Of course, we talked about this in discussing the snow goons, I believe, in our previous episode. And so when Calvin thinks burning leaves is necessary to appease the snow demons and avoid a warm winter, his dad says, I don't know whether your grasp of theology or meteorology is more appalling. So this could, again, just be theology in terms of his dad obviously doesn't believe in snow demons. It doesn't necessarily mean his father and or his mother do believe in God, but it seems reasonable that they would, at least in some sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. They probably do. And it makes sense. It's an American comic strip. Christianity is a pretty common religion in the United States. It would make lots of sense, especially in the 80s. So yeah, I would imagine there's some sort of belief there, and it makes sense to me. But whatever the case, we do know that Calvin's family definitely celebrates Christmas, and not an unusual thing for a lot of 6-year-olds. For Calvin, it's mostly about presents. So that winds up being the driving factor behind just about every Christmas strip, as we'll see. But first, before we get to the presents themselves, we got to take a minute and talk about where the presents go. So, the Christmas tree, of course. And there aren't a ton of strips that reference the Christmas trees, but there are a few that really stick out to me. So I'm thinking of a couple where Dad teases Calvin about what they're going to do with the Christmas tree or not do with it. In one of the daily strips, so not a Sunday strip, Calvin asks his dad when they're going to get the Christmas tree, and his dad says, "Oh, I don't know, probably sometime after New Year's." And Calvin says, "After New Year's?" And He says, yeah, we'll pick out the best one left out by the neighbors. Sometimes there's even still tinsel on it, so we won't even have to decorate it. And just teases him about that for a while. And then there's also one that's a Sunday strip where Calvin and his mom have picked out a tree, and he's really excited about how much loot will fit under it. And he says, Dad, come bring in the tree. And his dad says, no, I thought this year we would just leave it in the garage. In the garage? And yeah, it's going to save us the trouble of decorating it. We're not going to decorate it? And then his dad says, yeah, and on Christmas morning, if you get a present, and Calvin goes, if I get a present? And then his dad, just without missing a beat, continues on, yes, you can take it out to the garage to open and pretend that the tree has lots of lights. And Calvin runs off going, Mom! And his mom then in the last frame is giving Dad the stink eye and saying, I know somebody who's going to get a lot of coal in his stocking this year. So those are the ones I can think of with the Christmas tree.
Oh, for sure. And I have to add that the last one you mentioned, where his dad is just going on with this happy expression on his face, visualizing Calvin after Christmas, pretending there's lights and maybe a present. It's just that's one of my personal favorites. I really love the strips where Calvin's dad is either teasing him like this or imparting some dubious, like pseudo wisdom or explanation for something. Those always make me laugh so much. And I can kind of see it as, I mean, it's funny interaction in its own sense, but you can also sort of read it as this is Calvin's dad getting back at him a little bit for all the aggravation he gets through. So
Absolutely.
yeah, I don't know. That one always makes me laugh whenever I even think of it. Especially if I get a present, and then
Yes.
oh yeah, and then you can take it out to the garage, pretend the tree has lots of lights, and just
Yeah. Well, and I have to wonder, is Calvin's dad doing this as revenge on Calvin, or does Calvin kind of get some of his stuff from his dad? Where because there's at least one strip where Calvin says something like, "Dad harasses me with his morals, so I harass him with mine."
that's
When
true.
I believe it's when he calls his dad on a summer day and says something like, "It sure is a nice day outside. Climb a tree, goof off," or it might not be that one, but it's a strip along those lines where Calvin is kind of teasing his dad about, oh, I don't have to do anything. It's summer and you have to go to work. So, it's a two-way street there. Um,
Exactly.
and
Yeah, I think they feed off each other a little bit in that regard.
yeah, and we'll talk about those sorts of strips you were mentioning a lot more when we talk about Calvin's family in another episode. But I just want to point out with that specific strip in the 10th anniversary book, Bill Watterson said that Calvin's dad is based in large part on his own dad. And in that strip in the 10th anniversary book, the caption under it says, My dad used to do this. So that one comes from real life.
Oh yeah, that may have been like a yearly tradition then, where the dad pretends that, oh, I don't know, we're not going to go through all this trouble. Look, we'll save time and money if we wait till after Christmas or what have you. So
Exactly. Yeah. So we know that's where that comes from. This is Watterson pulled that from his actual life. Now, obviously, in addition to Christmas trees, on Christmas, another place presents can go is the stockings. And again, there aren't a ton of instances of stockings being mentioned in Calvin and Hobbes, but there are a few. So, in one of the earlier ones, Calvin notices that there's no stocking for Hobbes, and he says, Where's Santa gonna stick Hobbes' loot? And mom assures him that she'll make Hobbes a stocking, and then she worriedly turns to Dad and says, Hobbes' loot? And Dad says emphatically that he is done shopping for the year. And that strip ran just a couple of days before Christmas that year. So, it's leading right up to Christmas when that one happens.
exactly, yeah, that's another one where you really get the great sense of these people's personality and their emotions coming through. I mean, the dad doesn't just say he's done shopping; he kind of hunches down in his chair as if he's
Mm-hmm.
hiding and looking in his books, like, "Don't look at me, I'm done shopping."
Exactly. And then there's another one where Calvin and Hobbes are talking about how good Calvin has been. And Calvin says, I'll have you know I've been a veritable little angel this year, just like always. And Hobbes responds, In that case, we can have a cookout with the contents of your stocking. So that's a reference to stocking and a reference, of course, to coal in the stocking. But I like that interchange between Calvin and Hobbes.
Yeah, it would have been slightly more believable if he didn't add the "just like always" part, because then It's well, I mean, yeah, maybe he's been better this year than others, but yeah, that didn't pass the smell test, as they say.
Just like always. Yes, exactly. And then the other one I can think of that mentions stockings is actually, I think, the last story arc that ever ran in Calvin and Hobbes. And that's when, so Galaxoid and Nebular, they're the two aliens that helped Calvin with his leaf collection a few months prior to this. And then they show up again at his door. So, just for context, listeners, Galaxoid and Nebular show up while Calvin is trying to collect leaves for a project for school, and he doesn't want to do it, and he's doing it the night before. And then these aliens come and they say, we're here to, take us to the supreme earth potentate. And Calvin says, speaking. And anyway, after some negotiation, Calvin sells them the earth for 50 alien leaves. So after all that story, they come in December, ring the doorbell, and say, what the heck is wrong with this planet you sold us? This cold white glop covers us and freezes our innards. And Calvin says, well, it's snow. You better get used to it because we get it every year. And they are mad that he seems to have defrauded them on this deal where he sold them the earth. 50 leaves was far too much. So anyway, at the end of this story, Calvin and Hobbes are thinking we need to figure out a way for them to be warm. And what can they wear? They don't even have arms. They'd need like a giant sock or something. And Hobbes starts unpinning the stockings from the chimney, and Calvin's like, whoa, wait a minute. And Hobbes is cutting out holes for them, and it gives them to Galaxoid and Nebular, and it keeps them nice and warm. And Calvin is freaking out, and Hobbes reminds Calvin that, hey, you've done something good, so Santa will figure out a way. And Hobbes is like, you're right, I did. Or Calvin is like, you're right, I did something good. Talk about presents galore. I'm going to be rolling in presents. So again, Calvin's spirit of Christmas there.
Yes, and I always wondered how Calvin explained this to his mother and father later, like what happened to the stockings.
Yes.
Like clearly gone. I mean, warming the aliens, that is nice, but that's one of those cases where I always want to know, well, and then what happened? Which I guess is kind of the point. It's more funny if we don't know, but that's just something I always wondered about.
Yeah. And, I'm going to bring this up a little more later, but earlier, Calvin's mom said Hobbes loot, and she said she would make a stocking for Hobbes. So you could read it as she just made this stocking for Hobbes, and now they've destroyed it and it's gone missing. So it's kind of fun to imagine what her reaction to all that might be.
That's true. Doesn't Calvin also respond by saying, make it big, but not as big as mine?
Yes, that's correct. Hobbes'
Okay.
stocking needs to be big, but not as big as his.
Yeah. So again, I mean, so Calvin is looking out for his friend here. He wants his buddy to get loot, but maybe not quite as much as he gets. So
Yeah.
you still get more of a sense of his priorities there.
Well, yeah, obviously. I mean, there's finite resources, and you gotta look out for number one. That's one of Calvin's mottos.
That's true.
Okay, so we've talked about where we put the presents. Now we can talk about the presents themselves. So, what kind of presents does Calvin usually ask for? Weapons mostly. So, a few of my favorites are the heat-seeking guided missile, and his quip about that is 5 minutes with one of those babies will make up for this whole rotten month. And on similar lines, a thermonuclear smart missile and launcher. And finally, there's one where he shows his Christmas list to mom and says, want to see my Christmas list? And it's this giant tome. And she's leafing through it and she's like, this says volume 1. And Calvin's talking about, yeah, I cross-indexed the accessory items he'll need to get to go with each present. I try to help him out. And she says, this is alphabetized. Atom bomb through grenade launcher. And she's like, you're going to be one sad little kid on Christmas morning. That's the kind of present Calvin wants.
Yeah, and until we started talking about this, like I knew that he asked for weapons, and I remembered, of course, the heat-seeking guided missile and sort of thing, but it hadn't entirely occurred to me just how dominant weapons are in his requests, at least the ones we hear about. Now there are other times where he wants things that aren't just missiles, like the trip to the Natural History Museum comes to mind, where they get a bunch of dinosaur things, and he's trying to figure out if he can get Batman stuff this way too. So he doesn't only want weapons, but that does seem to be the main thing he asked for Christmas, which is interesting.
Yeah, I'm not sure he's ever asked for a non-weapon for Christmas in any sort of serious way. There
Hmm.
is the case where he asks only for peace and love for his fellow man, but it's an attempt at reverse psychology, and Hobbes suggests that that might be kind of risky, so he abandons that idea. But yeah,
That's true.
pretty much he asks for weapons,
And
which, by the
presumably
way,
does not receive them.
yeah. And I just as a side note, that puts me in mind of a story of my cousin when he was a little kid. We were at a family reunion and we were all going to a zoo, and his mom told him he had to leave his squirt gun or something in the car. And he said, "Why?" And she said, "Well, we're going to the zoo." And he said, "Without weapons?" So, it's a believable little kid sort of thing.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, you probably need to have something at least.
what are you going to defend yourself from monsters with? So,
Yeah, I mean, the animals are in cages, but monsters could be anywhere.
exactly. Now, you just brought up Calvin probably doesn't usually get what he's requesting, which, makes sense. But we actually do get some insight into the sorts of things that he gets. So, for example, one year he's writing to Santa and says he requested some weapon and said, "Instead, I received socks and a shirt. Let's get with the program, huh?" Or, he'll
So this
receive
is like
underwear.
obviously my list was mixed up with some other kids.
Yes. I believe he says you mixed up my order
Oh, there's
specifically. So yeah, he gets socks and a shirt and underwear and stuff like that sometimes for Christmas. Not from Santa, but one year he's writing a thank you note to his grandma, and he says, "Thank you for the nice box of crayons," which this is probably referring to Christmas because the strip ran on December 26th. It could have been a birthday gift, but probably Christmas. So he received crayons. There's a certificate entitled, this one's from Hobbes, a certificate entitling the bearer to 1 day pounce free of tiger attacks. And Hobbes also makes Calvin a cache of ready-made snowballs. So I guess that is one case where he sort of got weapons.
right. That's probably the closest he came.
Yeah. One year Hobbes gave Calvin some tuna fish, and Calvin's saying, "Oh, well, thanks. I feel terrible. I didn't get you a present." And Hobbes says, "Well, I thought of that. You can give those back to me. That would be a great present." And Calvin's like, "Oh, yeah, here you go, buddy." So, and then off screen, his parents are saying, "What happened to the pantry?" But then one other that comes to my mind that's just very sweet is they sneak downstairs and realize that Santa didn't bring Hobbes anything. And, his parents are going, "Oh, think quick." But while they're working on that, Calvin says, "Well, here's a hug from me for being my best friend." And Hobbes says, "The best gifts don't come in boxes. I'll treasure this one forever." So that one's kind of sweet. That's
Yeah,
Calvin giving Hobbes a present. And on a similar vein, one time I believe Hobbes gives Calvin a tiger hug.
that's right. I think he says something like, "Oh, don't squeeze so hard. You're pushing my tears out," or something like.
Yes. Yep.
I mean, he wouldn't cry in general, but he was being squeezed so hard. So
Yeah.
then there is one other reference to getting a Christmas present. I don't think that this occurs around Christmas time, but there's a few strips where Calvin and Hobbes are playing with a Ouija board. And then after this doesn't turn out to be as fun as they might have hoped, Calvin says, I didn't ask for this for Christmas. I asked for a computer.
Yeah. I like that one. With he asks, "Will he grow up to be president?" And the board's answer is, "God forbid." He says, "If I want an editorial, I'll ask for one, you stupid board." Um,
So maybe
but
the Ouija board really does know something after all.
yeah, but you have to wonder with getting a Ouija board for Christmas, that adds a layer to the question of just how religious Calvin's family might be when celebrating Christmas.
That's
Seems
true.
a little counter to that particular religion, but yeah, who knows?
Yeah, I think it's also interesting too. So well, I guess we also, based on that, he does ask for at least one thing that's not a weapon. So he asked for a computer. He again
Oh,
doesn't
that's true.
receive it.
Yeah, good point. Although
But
the
we
computer
also,
could be to guide the smartness
oh,
and stuff.
that's true. We do need to guide the missiles and things. So
But you're right. The
yeah,
computer
but I
in and of
think
itself is not a weapon.
yes, I also think it's interesting that he does. Well, he always seems happy that he gets presents in the first place, especially since this seems to be in doubt given his
Hmm.
likely inclusion on the naughty list. But we also never see him actually being disappointed about what he did get. I mean, he makes reference to things like, oh, I don't want to get socks and underwear or whatever. But even though he doesn't seem to ever get the arms and incendiary devices he asks for, he always does seem to be glad about the things he does get, which adds kind of another layer to it as well.
Yeah. Uh, he's not one sad little kid on Christmas morning. He's always super excited about Christmas.
Yes.
Now, I do find it interesting, uh, just in the realm of presents, we don't ever really see any presents that we know for sure he got from his parents as such. There are plenty of references to presents from Santa, but not directly his parents. We do see one instance where his parents are placing presents on Christmas Eve, and Calvin believes he's hearing Santa. It's unclear whether those presents are meant to be from Santa or from his parents, but we don't ever see, oh, here's one from me and dad, or me and mom, or
Right.
whatever the case may be.
Although
Presumably he gets presents from them, but we just don't see it specifically.
yes, and we do get indications, like you said, that he expects to receive presents from them and presumably does. So, for instance, there's one strip where Calvin comes to talk to his dad. In fact, he even starts very formally, "Dad, I'd like to have a little talk." And he says, "Okay." And he says something like, "Well, as the primary breadwinner in this home, it's your responsibility to make purchases, to express consumer confidence, and do what's right for the economy. So here's some big ticket items I've asked for Christmas. I can trust you to do what's right for the country." And so then the dad says, "Well, I've got to stop leaving the Wall Street Journal around." So
Yeah, that's true. So
yeah,
yeah,
so
there's Calvin
Calvin,
asking for presents.
right. So Calvin acts as if it's expected that his parents will give him some things, and then he tries to leverage his dad's great moral character and what he's read in the Wall Street Journal to try to push him in what he sees as the right direction there.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of a smart tactic. Good job, Calvin. A little
Calvin is not
self-serving
a
and
dumb kid, yeah. He may not do well in school, but he's pretty smart when it comes to it.
yeah, shrewd might be an appropriate
Shrewd.
word there.
Yes.
So that kind of brings me to the point of Santa, because we've got Calvin's parents possibly acting as Santa here. It's a little unclear the strip's take on the nature of Santa. I mean, I think we can assume it's at least from Calvin's parents' perspective. I'm sorry if there are any little kids listening to this, that they are Santa, but it's a fun kind of the same sort of thing as the reality of Hobbes, of what's going on with Santa in Calvin and Hobbes. So there is the possibility of Calvin's parents as Santa. So there's the one I just mentioned where, so the context is Calvin and Hobbes are up in their room on Christmas Eve trying to go to sleep, but also kind of trying to wait up and see if Santa comes. And then they hear something downstairs and they're like, oh, that could be Santa. I heard a thump. And then the camera switches to his dad, and the quote is, "Slippin' ribbon ding fang rotten zerg burger ding dong," as his dad is holding his foot hopping around.
Which
And
is
his mom
pretty
saying,
good as far as like pretend swear words go.
yeah, not bad. And Calvin right before that is saying, he's saying something, I can't quite make it out. And then it switches to that. And mom is saying, dear, Calvin will hear you. So that's probably them acting as Santa.
Yeah.
Um, and there's the reference we made to Hobbs loot, and dad saying, don't look at me, I'm done shopping. So obviously they're not expecting Santa to bring anything. They're expecting that they're going to have to provide whatever that loot is going to be.
Right. One thing you don't ever get in the strip is something that you maybe see on sort of family TV shows sometimes where, oh, no one believes in Santa, but then, oh, some unexplainable thing happened. Maybe it really what you don't get that. It's like you
Yeah.
said, we have Calvin most of the time when he's not being more philosophical. He generally thinks that Santa is real and is judging his behavior and so on, but then the parents adopt the stance that, well, they're the ones shopping and placing the presents and so forth.
Yeah. There's also the case where mom is telling Calvin he's going to be one sad kid on Christmas morning,
I believe
which
it was
could,
the atom bomb, the grenade launcher strip you
yes,
mentioned earlier. Yeah.
yes. And you could take that as, well, I don't believe Santa's going to bring you that stuff, but you could also take it as, look, I know perfectly well what Santa is bringing you, and it's definitely not that.
Yeah,
So
I mean, it works either way because I would
yeah,
think even on the presumption that Santa does exist, I think with a high degree of confidence, his mom is probably accurate in stating that.
probably not going to bring any atom bombs. Yeah.
No. Then there's also on a related strip where Calvin's setting out cookies for Santa, and he says, "Oh, what do you think Santa would like with these cookies? More milk?" And his dad responds, "I think Santa would probably prefer a cold beer." To which, again, Calvin's mom is not thrilled about this remark.
Yes, she says her classic line whenever Calvin's dad is saying something he shouldn't be, dear. But
Okay.
whatever the nature of Santa here, Calvin is sure to write letters to Santa and in a couple of instances sort of receive letters back from Santa. So
Kind of.
often, yeah, yeah. And we'll talk about those in a second. Now, his lists for Santa are generally enormous. There's the alphabetized atom bomb through grenade launcher list that's just this huge stack of papers. There's also one where Calvin is taking his list to the mailbox and he says, and Hobbes is walking him to the mailbox, and Hobbes says, "Did you put anything on your list for me?" And he says, "Heck, no, this is breaking my arms already. I don't want to add any more weight to this." And Hobbes says, "Tidings of comfort and joy to you too." So maybe that's the same list. I don't know, but whatever the case, these lists are enormous enough that he feels like they're breaking his arms. So he likes to write. He has lots of requests, these big ticket items, like he gave his dad.
I mean, we need those for the economy. I guess if Santa's making them, it wouldn't help the economy, but still.
Yeah, it's true. But you got to get them from somewhere. If Dad's not going to do it, I've got Santa as a backup.
It actually, speaking of dad and Santa, it kind of reminds me of a small story from when I was a child. So, I was probably 4, something like that. So I still believed in Santa, and I received this package of like train cars for an electric train set. But it turned out that one of them, I think a caboose, was missing some wheels. And so I said, "Oh, well, this one doesn't have all the wheels on it." And so my dad said, "Oh, well, I'll take it to a store and exchange it." And I asked, I said, "Well, will the store take it since Santa gave us that one?"
Mm.
My dad was like, "Oh, yeah, they'll still exchange it." I said, "Oh, well, that's nice." I'm like, but so I wasn't like super skeptical, but I was, smart enough, I guess we'll say to say like, well, wait. I mean, yeah, if the store sold it to you, that would make sense. But this didn't come from the store; it came from Santa, and so I don't know if
Yeah,
my dad and mother exchanged some kind of meaningful look at that point, but I kind of look back at that now and laugh. It's like
yeah.
me asking that, and then oh well, yeah, they'll still do it. Like,
Hmm. Yeah, I remember something similar with that. Something about, my sister told me that my parents had Santa's phone number or something so they could, talk to him and fix whatever the problem was. Or one time, I had lost a tooth and then I lost the quarter or whatever that I got for that tooth. And well, my parents, they know the tooth fairy, so they were able to get me another quarter. And I just didn't really give it a lot of thought. It was, oh, okay, my parents handled it. That's cool. As long as
yeah,
I
I
got my
mean, we
quarter.
get things all the time. Like,
Yeah. Another letter that I like that Calvin writes, he says, this year, this is Calvin's baby brother Melville, which what a name. But Calvin is
yeah.
trying to convince Santa that there are two kids now, so there needs to be twice as much loot.
Right. Yeah, he's very clear about this. It's like, no, remember there are 2 kids at this house, not just one. So this isn't Calvin's list, this is Melville's. Yeah. And yeah, so and it ends just with Hobbes kind of skeptically saying Melville, and Calvin saying, "Oh, if this works, I'm going to add a new baby brother every year." But I did kind of wonder, and I hadn't necessarily thought of this until now, really, but I wonder if there's any significance to Melville or if it's just a funny name to use. So the only thing I can really think of that it could be a reference to would be Herman Melville, but I'm not really sure how that would relate. I mean, we've talked a little bit about the names Calvin and Hobbes as references to John Calvin and Thomas Hobbes, but I don't.
Right.
There's at least nothing top of my mind about Herman Melville that would make him significant in this way. But maybe listeners, if you have an idea on that, let us know what you think.
Yeah. I mean, the only thing that comes to mind is, I can't think of a connection between Herman Melville and John Calvin or Thomas Hobbes, but Miss Wormwood, as we'll maybe discuss in a later episode, is named after Wormwood of the Screw Tape Letters, which also isn't exactly related to John Calvin or Thomas Hobbes, although it's a little closer than Herman Melville is.
Right.
But, so it could be just Bill Watterson finding references to authors that he likes or something.
That's true. It could be just, yeah, it's fun to make sort of literary allusions, even if they don't have a super deeper meaning or something.
Yeah. But I also don't know enough about Herman Melville. Maybe there's something about being deceptive in Moby Dick that fits with this or something. Yeah,
I
listeners, let us know if
don't
you have
either.
thoughts.
Yeah, I've
What?
read a fair amount of literature, but I can say again, this happened when I was little. My father suggested that I read Moby Dick, and it was awful. I hated it. So it was so boring, just long descriptions that didn't ever make any sense or go anywhere. So finally, I'm like, no, please don't make me read this anymore. And I liked to read, so yeah. I mean, apologies to anyone who loves Melville or anything, but yeah, disagree here. We'll say.
Tell us how you really feel, Indy.
I know, right? But anyway, yeah. So, listeners, if you have given Melville more of a chance than I have and have more of an appreciation for him, then maybe let us know if there's anything we're not sure of where there might be a deeper significance to the name Melville other than just kind of a funny, unusual name for Calvin to have come up with.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know enough about it to say. Now, uh, just on the lines of additional letters, a personal favorite of mine is Calvin is writing to Santa and he says, "This year I've been extra good." So, and Hobbes goes, and Calvin gives him the dirtiest look. I don't know how Bill Watterson pulled off the look that Calvin gave him, but it makes me laugh every time. I mean, I've used the word stink eye before in this podcast, but if there was ever a stink eye, this is the one.
Yeah, I think so. Both that the thing and Hobbes' expression as he tries to stifle his laugh, hold on to his mouth, his one eye has gotten really big, and just both of that. So that combined with the yeah, I would say textbook definition of stink eye. That's I agree.
Yes.
Looking at that art makes me crack up every time.
Yeah, there were some cases Watterson said sometimes he had weaker ideas narratively, and so he would go for broke on the illustration. Now, I don't know that this one particularly was weaker narratively, but I can absolutely see Watterson going for broke on the illustration in this one,
Oh, sure.
whether the rest of the comic were funny or not. Although I think the rest of it is funny. Calvin ends by saying, "Perhaps you need a drink of water," and Hobbes says, "I think I do," as he walks off.
Yeah,
Uh,
Calvin was remarkably restrained, at least in what he says. Now, again, the expression is worth 1,000 words, I suppose. But yeah, I would agree. This
yes,
is one where, yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say the writing is weaker or anything, but this seems like one where the art is more the focus than the writing.
yeah. And then we mentioned a bit ago Calvin's sort of receiving letters from Santa. So, uh, in one case, Hobbes comes up to Calvin claiming that a letter that he's handing to him is from Santa, and the letter tells him to be nice to animals. I think actually you had some thoughts on this one, Indy, so I'll let you jump in here.
Yeah, so I think he says, "Oh, I've made a list, but there's no point in checking it twice because you're obviously the naughtiest kid in the world." And then, of course, Calvin is freaking out. "Oh no, I'm doomed!" And then Hobbes kind of subtly encourages him periodically to keep reading, and then maybe he says how you can get off the naughty list or something, and then the longer it goes on, it's all, well, you should start being nice, for instance, to animals. Maybe an animal would like a snack, or you could offer to let an animal read your comic books. And so it does become more and more obvious that this is specifically targeted to Calvin being nice to Hobbes.
Right. And it's signed Santa Claus, where Claus is spelled Claws, and that's what finally tips Calvin off. He's like, "Santa Claus? Wait a minute, I know this handwriting." And Hobbes is like, "Well, that's what Santa would have said if he weren't so busy."
Yeah, But I love that whole thing, and then especially Calvin's reactions about all this, and just oh no, and like
Yeah. Well, the letter starts out, "Dear Calvin, you rotten little kid."
it's
Oh
like
no,
oh
Santa
no,
called me rotten.
yeah,
And then on the flip side of that, there's another one where Calvin is saying, this is done in a poem, and he says, my palms were all sweaty, my face had gone pale, a letter from Santa just arrived in the mail. And the poem goes on and says, this year I'm writing because I've repealed my naughty nice laws. So Santa has flipped the script and said he wants kids to gargle your peas and never say thank you, you're welcome, or please, and all these things, so that Calvin is going to be rewarded for his bad behavior. And at the end, it says, "Good little kids make me sick. It's no joke. Sincerely signed, Santa." And then I awoke. I hate being good or trying to fake it. 6 days until Christmas. I don't think I'll make it. So again, he doesn't actually receive a letter from Santa here, but he dreams that he did.
right. And we get to see all of these things coming to fruition, right? So the
Mm-hmm.
good little children who are all nice and well behaved, just crying because they didn't get anything, whereas Calvin in this dream does receive what appears to be some sort of bomb. So you see,
Yep.
is giving this sort of triumphant, evilish laugh and delight as he's gotten this for Christmas. And you get to see Santa's sort of facial expressions when he's thinking about those obnoxious good children. And it's really
Yeah.
classic, though. And you read a few of the lines from the poem. The whole thing done in poem, as you mentioned, is great. I think it's that whole strip is kind of a standout favorite, I would say.
Yeah, it's a great one. And I think that leads us nicely into the whole role of Santa as a judge, sort of here, where Calvin makes great efforts to convince Santa that he's been good. For instance, there's a story arc where Calvin gets Hobbes to be his lawyer so that they can go to the North Pole and make their case to Santa that Calvin's been good. And I like that in this story, Hobbes agrees. He says, okay, but I don't take pro bono cases. So I like that little one off line. But also, Hobbes' legal strategy is to establish that Calvin was insane at the time of the alleged crimes. And Calvin's like, no, you don't. We want to establish that I didn't commit these crimes in the first place. And Hobbes is like, well, I'll have you know that insulting a lawyer is something like a
Violation
penal
of
offense or
the code
something.
or something. Yeah.
Yeah. And then they start making their way to the North Pole to make their case, and they get like halfway down the block before Calvin and Hobbes get into a fight. So establishing that Calvin is a good kid is a tough sell in this particular instance.
Yes, I also love just how naturally and automatically Hobbes turns to the insanity defense. It's not even like pitching it to him as maybe this would be a good idea. He just says, "Okay, we'll try to establish that you were insane at the time of the incident." So it's like, of
Yes.
course that's what we do. What are you talking about?
What else would we do? We know you did it. So
You're obviously guilty. What?
and in the final Christmas Eve strip, we see Santa mulling over whether or not to give Calvin presents. And so there's this great exchange between Santa and an elf where the elf is saying, well, there's still the matter of this Calvin kid. I always, for some reason, imagine the elf talking in like an Irish accent or a Scottish accent or something, by the way. Well, there's still the matter of this Calvin kid or something like that. But that's just my headcanon.
Okay. Yeah, but no, it's great. So I think, yeah, it's they're almost done loading the sleigh, but because there's still this matter of the Calvin kid, which is so hard to solve, they haven't quite gotten to that case yet. And then one of my like favorite lines in the entire strip is when the elf is describing points in Calvin's favor, and he says, "Well, a tiger vouches for the kid's character, says he tries to be sort of good if he's not tempted otherwise," which
Yes.
is pretty accurate, but also some of the funniest like moral character vouching I've ever heard of. It's like the just about as much of not anything that you could possibly think of while dressed up in nice sounding language, we might say.
And I can absolutely see Hobbes saying that too.
Oh yeah, that's completely in character for Hobbes. Like in fact, there's also that can even be kind of a callback to a previous strip where again Calvin, I think, is talking to Hobbes about how like, oh, I always try to be good as soon as, but then he sees Susie coming, so he starts to make a snowball to throw at her. And Hobbes says something like, well, until an idea pops into your head or something like that. So,
Yep.
but yeah, tries to be sort of good if he's not tempted otherwise is one of my favorite lines in all of Calvin and Hobbes.
That is a great line. And with all of that in mind, with Santa being the judge, and also some of Calvin's questions about Santa, one of his questions, in addition to "Does Santa exist?" is Santa a jolly old elf or a CIA spook? He says this after listening to the song "Santa Claus is Coming to Town." He sees you when you're sleeping. He knows when you're awake. Oh, it
Yeah,
sounds more
that's
like a
kind of
CIA
creepy when
spook.
you think about it.
Yeah, a little unnerving.
Yeah, there's also some strips where he makes reference to this, like saying, "Oh well, Santa couldn't be watching it every moment. He's got all the kids in the world to look at. So if I smack Susie with a snowball really quick, the odds of him seeing it right then are practically zero or something."
Right. And if that might be the same one, I don't think it's the same one, but there's one where Susie says, I see you, Calvin. Santa's watching you right now. And Calvin kind of debates her on that. And she's like, well, I'm mailing a letter to him. And I could add a bit on there. Well, do you have a pen? As a matter of fact, I do. And so he's weighing his options there.
Yeah,
Speaking of which, Calvin has this inner war between his desire to misbehave and his desire to get lots of presents or loot. And of course, the biggest temptation is whether or not to throw slush balls at Susie. So there's the one I just mentioned, Santa's watching you right now, and she's mailing the letter to Santa. There's one where Calvin, we've mentioned this one before actually, but Calvin nails her with a snowball and then she clobbers him. And so Calvin's line at the end of that strip is, Santa's going to skip this block for years.
yeah, it's interesting that we mentioned before. Usually, it's only from the perspective of Calvin being bad that we see this, where if he throws a snowball, he's giving a temptation, where we don't get that a whole lot with Susie. But this is one of the few instances where a reference is made, oh yeah, Susie's not completely innocent either. Maybe this is
Mm-hmm.
also counting against her.
Yeah, and on a similar note, there's one where Calvin hits her with a snowball and then says, I'm sorry. And she says, not as sorry as you're gonna be, and comes after him.
Yeah.
And then I think in the one you were referencing where he says, I try to be good. I'm good all the time. And then Hobbes says, until an idea enters your head. I believe in the next strip, I could be crossing my wires here, but there's a strip where Calvin throws a snowball at Susie after talking about being good, and then he says, "See, I wanted to put a rock in the snowball, but I didn't, so that should count for something." So, how what counts as good? There's good, and then there's good.
Right.
So,
Yeah, and as Hobbes likes to say, well, Santa may have to take what he can get in your case.
yes, and couple of other instances of Calvin battling between being good and misbehaving. He's wanting to be good, and so in one instance, he decides to stay in bed all day, and his mom is telling him to get up, and he says, "No, if I stay in bed all day, I can't do anything bad." And mom says, "Disobeying your mother and staying in bed instead of going to school isn't good; it's bad." And so Calvin says, "That darn Santa has me every way I turn," as he's hopping around getting his clothes on to go to school. So that's one attempt to try to be good. Doesn't go so well. And then there's another little story arc where he resolves to do 10 spontaneous acts of goodwill every day. And among these, he lets Hobbes read his comic books, but he gives him a list of instructions. You have to make sure not to touch any of the pages so you don't get any oil on them. Just touch, I think he calls it the Mylar bag. And you have to use these
Yeah, use
tongs that
like
are sterilized.
page, yeah.
Yeah. And Hobbes is like, I don't think spontaneous acts of goodwill should be so reluctant. And Calvin yells, reluctant ones qualify. Um, there's another in that series where he's choking down dinner and he says something like, I'm guessing this is raw maggots on guano, but I'm choking it down as best I can. That's his
Really kind of
spontaneous
cursed
act.
in that too. It's like, I hope you're happy, Santa, darn you, or something.
Yes. And his mom, of course, is not super impressed with this particular act of goodwill.
Yeah, for
And
some reason she doesn't feel great about his reaction there.
yeah, and then one other thing in that arc, he's talking about how he wants to hit Susie with a snowball, of course. And Hobbes is like, well, aren't you trying to do your spontaneous acts of goodwill? And Calvin says, it's not even afternoon yet. I'll do them later. And Hobbes is like, well, it's not going to qualify if you spend all morning doing bad things. So Calvin has to have a think about that.
Yeah,
So
at one point he comes up, he's like, okay, well, what if I goof off now, but then in the afternoon I can do 20 acts of goodwill?
yeah, so he sees it as very much a quantitative, the good acts counteract the bad acts more than a I shouldn't do the bad acts sort of thing.
Right. And it also, I don't know if this was anything intentional with the strip so much, but it kind of makes me think of the sort of things we may all have a temptation to rationalize about ourselves to, not necessarily with right and wrong, but saying like, oh, well, I know I was going to dedicate the morning to accomplishing XYZ, but maybe I'll rest just a little bit more and then I'll, really
Yeah,
I'll do XYZ and something else in the afternoon. It's like that
yeah,
never really works out, even if you mean it and aren't just saying that to yourself. So it kind of puts me in mind of that. It's like, well, I know I had all these great intentions, but I'll just compress them into a smaller, more intense area or time frame later. That's usually a ticket to not getting anything done at all.
yeah. Calvin's definitely not the only one with that mindset. I think that afflicts all of us at some point or another.
Yes, that's one to be more like Calvin's dad about.
And since we're talking about philosophy a little bit, Calvin sometimes waxes philosophical about what it actually means to be good. So there's one where he's on a sled ride. If you'll remember from last episode, we talked about how the sled rides are often either visual metaphors for something Calvin's talking about, or at the very least, just letting him talk about something that he wants to talk about while still having something interesting going on. And in this one, the main thrust is he says, do I really have to be good or do I just have to act good? And this is the one where Hobbes says, in your case, I think Santa will have to take what he can get. And then Calvin takes it a step further and says, okay, so how good do you think I have to act? Really good or just pretty good? So Calvin
Yeah.
is clearly not interested in actually being good. It's just whatever I got to do to get the presents and nothing more.
Yes, and literally nothing more. Like, what is the exact numerical amount of good I need to be to achieve my goal with the least
Yes.
amount of infringement upon my desire to misbehave?
Yeah. And on a similar note, Calvin asks about how Santa is essentially grading on a curve, maybe, or maybe should be. He says, it's easy for, I love this line, it's easy for some sickeningly wholesome nerd to be good. The true test is if you can resist your inner desire to be bad, which Hobbes responds to that one. Of course, in your case, the question is academic because Calvin has once again thrown a snowball at Susie. And that's actually the one where he wanted to put the rock in the snowball. So, yeah, maybe it doesn't matter so much in Calvin's case because he's not even going to act good anyway.
True. And I have to think that insofar as the Christmas and Santa ponderings really do form a nice backdrop and analogy for a lot of the philosophy in this strip, I tend to think that's no accident. I mean, it's easy to see this as sort of a almost unintentional metaphor. It's like, oh yeah, but I kind of think Bill Watterson likely did a lot of this on purpose. A lot
Yeah.
of the things that Calvin talks about, or even just kind of throwaway references, like Calvin's dad tries to bore Calvin to sleep by reading him out of, I believe, readings in dialectical metaphysics.
Right.
So anyway, there's a lot of references and analogical content to philosophical questions, which I think is no accident. I think this is something that Watterson obviously playfully and humorously actually wanted to talk about and provoke people to think about.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. Now, all of that philosophy and what does it mean to be good and everything aside, ultimately, Calvin's pretty mischievous. I don't we could argue that he's not really a bad kid if you want, because we've
No,
talked about that before. And ultimately, Calvin does always end up getting presents regardless. So, for example, in one Christmas, Calvin proclaims that he has received total acquittal on all charges, complete exoneration.
Is that the same one where he had first asked Hobbes to be his lawyer, or is that a different instance?
It might be the same year, but I think that's just a standalone strip. It's one long panel daily strip. The whole thing is him saying that, and I think the dad is saying something like, "I still think this could have waited until after sunrise," and mom says, "Shh, take a picture." Um,
That sounds right. Yeah, it
yeah,
is funny to think about that in the context of if he literally did try to get legal counsel to defend him.
yeah, yeah. So even if it wasn't in the same year or the same story arc, you could see it as being connected.
Yes.
Which, as a quick diversion, we talked in the first episode about how Calvin is always six, but somehow has multiple first days of first grade. And he also has multiple Christmases as a 6 year old, unless maybe you want to headcanon that every Christmas we see in Calvin and Hobbes is actually the same Christmas. So I just thought maybe we could try to see if we can do that, connect some of the dots that we've been talking about. Is it possible that it's all the same Christmas? So, for instance, he's seeking legal counsel and then proclaims complete exoneration. So, even if those aren't the same year, we could connect those dots. So, I don't know. What do you think? Do you think it's all the same Christmas, or is it just something I shouldn't think about too hard?
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously, as we talked about, that sort of question pervades a lot of the strip. So Calvin strangely is eternally sick. So we get the multiple versions of so many things. I don't know. It is fun to think about. So you mentioned before how funny it would be if his mother had literally just made a stocking for Hobbes because there was no place to put Hobbes' loot, and then immediately thereafter, Calvin and Hobbes give them away to Galaxoid and Nebular. That would add
Right.
another dimension of humor to those strips. Um,
Yeah. But I'm
yeah,
thinking of,
go
stuff
ahead.
like Hobbes gives Calvin tuna fish and a cache of snowballs and a certificate for day pounce free of tiger attacks. But then there are other strips where neither of them got each other a present, so they give each other hugs. So it's a little bit more difficult to reconcile those. So
It is. I mean,
I
we
don't know.
could say it doesn't seem like the parents get presents on Christmas. I mean, maybe they do, and we just don't see that because it's mostly from Calvin's point of view, and that's not particularly
Yeah.
funny in that sense. But if it's just the sort of thing where, Christmas presents are for children, parents do their own thing or whatever, you could think of it as most of these presents are either from the parents or from Santa, and maybe some of them are multiple ones from Calvin and or Hobbes to each other. I don't know. I mean, you're probably right. There's some that are more difficult to reconcile than others, but it is interesting to think about in that sense. Could these be consistently all just connected events in one Christmas?
Yeah. And it ultimately probably is something that we shouldn't be thinking too hard about, but it is fun to kind of give it a little thought.
For sure. Yeah, it could even be sort of like maybe not explicitly, but if you've ever seen the old movie Clue at the end, or it says, or
Hmm.
it could have happened like this. And so these are all sort of thematic ways in which Calvin responds to Christmas and the sort of things he does. And maybe the exact form that it takes could be any one or multiple of these things that we see.
Yeah, yeah, I like that. The clue analogy is a good one. Now, we've covered a lot of Christmas, leading up to and a little bit about Christmas itself, but let's take a minute to talk about Christmas Eve and Christmas morning themselves. So, to start that, we would like to give you, dear listeners, a dramatic reading of one of our favorite Calvin and Hobbes poems titled Christmas Eve. On window panes, the icy frost leaves feathered patterns criss-crossed,
But in our house, the Christmas tree is decorated festively.
with tiny dots of colored light that cozy up this winter night.
Christmas songs, familiar, slow, play softly on the radio.
Hops and hisses from the fire whistle with the bells and choir.
My tiger is now fast asleep, on his back and dreaming deep.
When the fire makes him hot, he turns to warm whatever's not.
Propped against him on the rug, I give my friend a gentle hug.
Tomorrow's what I'm waiting for, but I can wait a little more. So I love that poem. I feel like it captures the essence of Christmas Eve as a kid, waiting for presents, waiting to open them and just bursting with anticipation, but also enjoying that anticipation and the night of Christmas Eve and the special feeling that comes with it.
Right. This is a rare case where Calvin seems to be living up to his father's advice in that sense. I mean, in Calvin's mind, there's almost nothing better than Christmas morning itself. But here he really can enjoy the anticipation and just take in the moment and be with Hobbes in this way, which, at least for then, is even better than the prospect of getting grenade launchers and atom bombs on Christmas morning.
Yes, exactly. So he can wait a little more. There are also a lot of strips about not being able to sleep on Christmas Eve. So we've mentioned several of those already, but I just want to say I remember that as a kid, not being able to sleep on Christmas Eve and just being so excited for Christmas morning the next day. There are also some strips about getting up early on Christmas morning. So there's one where they're trying to wait as long as they can, letting mom and dad sleep in. And so they're gritting their teeth and closing their eyes. And we get the sense that it's probably 5 minutes or less that they're waiting in. And they say, Mom, Dad, wake up, it's Christmas. And, it's dark 30 in the morning. On that note, in my family, we were not allowed to leave our rooms on Christmas morning until my parents gave the all clear. Now, lest anyone think my parents were being really mean about this, they gave the all clear at like 7 in the morning. It's not like they were
You had to
not
wait
letting
that
us get
long?
up. Yeah, right. But they just didn't want us coming out at like 5 in the morning.
Right. We had a similar rule in our house. It was like we were allowed to go down to sort of the landing above the staircase and we could see the Christmas tree and the presents from there, but we weren't allowed to go down or wake up our parents until I don't know exactly what time, but some time like that in the morning.
Yeah.
However, there was one memorable occasion. I was probably 3 or 4, my sister a little bit older, and the Christmas tree had fallen over. So we were like, "Oh, mommy, daddy, the Christmas tree fell over." And of course, they're not going to fall for this, right? Like, "Oh no, it didn't. Go back to bed." We're like, "No, the Christmas tree fell over." So no, it didn't. You're just saying that. Go to bed. I'm like, "No, really, the Christmas tree fell over." And so finally, our dad goes, "Okay, let's see the Christmas tree that fell over." So then he comes out reluctantly to the landing and he sees that in fact it had. He's like, "Oh no, wait, come here. The Christmas tree really did fall over." And we're like, "See, we told you. It's all we said." Like,
Yeah. Boy, did he have egg on his face.
yeah, and worse than that, the presents had water on their faces, so we had to like hurriedly open a bunch of the presents quicker than we meant to because they were getting soaked and like there's water on the carpet and things. So yeah, it wasn't an artificial tree. This was a real tree with water in the stand. So that was a
That
bit of
is
a
a
mess.
memorable Christmas.
Yeah, but we never let them live that down. We're always like, "Your adorable children were completely honest in telling you about this emergency, and you refuse to believe us."
Parents, am I right?
Yeah, what are you gonna do with them? Yeah, so let this be a lesson to any parents out there. If your children say the Christmas tree fell over, believe them.
Mm-hmm. Otherwise, you're going to have soggy presents and it's going to be all your fault.
You'll ruin Christmas through your
Yeah,
disbelief. Weird to
exactly.
not hear that in like a religious standpoint, but yeah, in a purely secular sense, your disbelief ruined Christmas.
Yes. Now, on that note of when you're allowed out of your room or not, I don't know exactly what the rules are for Calvin, but they do sneak downstairs to count packages. And Hobbes says, I get to plug in the tree lights. And that's the one where Calvin finds that there are no presents for Hobbes and says, Mom, Dad, Santa didn't bring Hobbes anything. And Mom is saying, oh, think quick, dear. And Dad's saying, it better be a lot later than it feels like. And Hobbes' response is it's a good thing tigers are naturally gifted to begin with. So there's the corollary to Hobbes giving Calvin the tiger hug. That's the one where Calvin says, well, here's a present for me anyway for being my best friend. Hope it fits. And that's when Hobbes says, the best presents don't come in packages. I'll treasure this one forever.
Yeah, and this actually ties into a feature of Hobbes' character that we see on other occasions too. So one notable difference between him and Calvin is this sort of attitude. So Hobbes is generally contented with life and has few wants and seems to be happier for it. So a couple examples come to mind. There's one, I think these are both fairly early strips, but they're talking about what they would wish for if they could have a wish granted. So Hobbes's wish is for a big sunny field to lay in. And
Yeah.
then Calvin criticizes us. He's like, well, you could have anything. You could wish for this and that and anything you could imagine. All you want is a field. But then he
Well, and I
sees
think he says, "You've
Hobbes.
got that now."
Yeah, right. He says, you've got that now. You already have a sunny field. But then he sees Hobbes just very contentedly laying in the field with his eyes closed and a big smile on his face. And Calvin says, actually, it's hard to argue with someone who looks so happy.
Mm-hmm.
And then on another occasion, Calvin, they're similarly talking about wishes, and Calvin's saying something like he wishes for like a car that turns into a jet that does some other thing too. And all Hobbes wishes for is a sandwich, which again, Calvin is very critical of. But then we see them inside and Hobbes is having a sandwich. He says, I got my wish.
Yeah.
So we see, and that's one of the, I would say, big differences between their personalities. Calvin is always wanting something new or thinking about how much cooler it would be if things were different or he had some certain new object. Not always weapons, but frequently, like we said, whereas Hobbes has simple desires that are then in fact fulfilled, and then he's much happier because of that.
Yeah. In fact, that reminds me of another one where Calvin is standing there saying, "Here I am, all happy and content, but not euphoric." And so then once he realizes he's merely content and not euphoric, and well, now my day is ruined. So,
That's right. Yeah, if
contentment
only
isn't
I
good
were
enough.
a little happier than I am now. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. He's never happy with where he is, or I shouldn't say never. He's often unhappy with what he has and wants more.
Right. I'm happy to a certain degree, but not an extreme degree. So it's not good
Yeah.
enough, and now I'm unhappy. Yeah.
And listeners, that'll be our philosophical takeaway from this episode. If you take one thing from this, it's to learn to be content with what you have. And now I'll get off my high horse.
But I'll get back on the high horse and say, as a teaser, we're going to have a whole episode devoted to philosophy and Calvin and Hobbes. So many of the issues that we alluded to here, spoke briefly about, we'll go into in more depth there, use some of them as a springboard. So we're pretty excited for that, as we are for all our episodes. And so we hope you'll join us for that one too.
Yeah, and so if you want to send us your favorite winter strips, because obviously we can't have gone over all of them, or if you want to send us your favorite strips that might tie into the philosophy of Calvin and Hobbes, maybe we can shout you out when we get to that episode. We'd love to hear from you. You can email us at magiccandh@proton.me. There will be a link in the show notes, and that's magiccandh@proton.me.
And remember, this podcast is completely free and completely ad-free. We are not affiliated with Bill Watterson or his syndicate, nor do we feel it would be right to make any kind of money off of it. So we just hope you'll continue to join us as fans of the strip who love talking about this great work of comic art.
Absolutely. And if you like what we're doing, tell your friends about us and please leave us a review. And as always, let's go exploring. You've been listening to The Magic of Calvin and Hobbes, a fan celebration. We'll be releasing 40 episodes all throughout the year, from November 18th, 2025 to November 18th, 2026, to celebrate the 40th anniversary. Our intro and outro music is Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture, referenced in the Calvin and Hobbes strip published on October 8, 1986. This rendition was performed by the Skidmore College Orchestra and made available under a Creative Commons license on museopen.com. We hope you'll join us next episode for more fun.